on this computer. There we go. Okay, and we're back. Okay. Are y'all seeing that now? The 14th Amendment? Okay, good. All right. Prior to the 14th Amendment, all we had was a Bill of Rights, which was a list of restrictions on federal power. So to answer my own question, why do we have a Bill of Rights? The anti-federalists demanded it because they were afraid of federal power. Okay. One of my favorite things to point out in the Constitution is if you ask an average person, you know, who had the right to vote under the original Constitution? And people say like, well, the Constitution only let white men vote and they only let people vote if you had property. And I'm like, that's not in the Constitution at all. That's like, there's, in fact, surprise, there's nothing in the Constitution about suffrage rights. It was entirely left to the states. And surprise, the states behave badly too. Sometimes the states do bad things like, I don't know, slavery, okay? And so, you know, it was the states that were denying suffrage rights to women and to people that weren't white, you know, and so forth. And so the 14th Amendment is a post-Civil War amendment where there's like this recognition. It's like, hello, states, you guys were bad, you know, when you left the Union and all that and had slaves and all that. So we're going to make you do stuff. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which, by the way, there's a due process clause in the federal Constitution. But this is applying it to the states, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the law. So this due process clause has been the epicenter, if I can use a slightly large word, the focal point, the center of interest with regard to this concept of substantive due process. And I'm using my air quotes heavily there because that is what this new Roe versus Wade ruling, which would overturn Roe versus Wade, is attacking. Because here's a little secret, okay? Substantive due process, which is the mechanism by which you force states to recognize fundamental rights, like the right to privacy, is made up by the courts. This elevated importance of fundamental rights is basically, I'm pointing at the screen like you can see me. Okay. If you look at this word liberties, state, it basically, here's what the court reads it as, okay? Nor shall any state deprive any person of liberty without due process, only they don't want to define that, so that basically they're saying the states can't deprive people of certain types of liberty. And if we say it's important enough, then that counts. And the without due process clause, which was originally designed for criminal defendants, okay? Like you can't put someone in jail just because you think they committed a crime. You have to actually prove it and stuff and go to court and all that. Okay, that's what due process is. But what the court has done is they've hijacked that due process clause and used it as a mechanism. I'm going to use a way to recognize this. Okay, you guys should all know about the supremacy clause, right? Look at the supremacy clause. Okay, supremacy clause says, Article 6, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. Listen carefully because it's important. I need a thumbs up if you're listening. I see one person's listening, 2 people. Okay, 3. Okay. All right. What the court has done with this concept of substantive due process is they have used the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, which places limits on the states. They have used that as a judicially imposed supremacy clause at the behest of whatever the Supreme Court determines is important enough. This is why people freak out, especially conservatives, about judicial activism, because the courts, and by the way, this is also why it's World War III, whenever there's an opening on the court, that's going to sway the court one way or the other. So, you know, back to that other question, why did the Republicans hold the seat open for when Obama appointed Merrick Garland? Because Merrick Garland's a liberal in the eyes of the conservatives, at least, and they didn't want the ideological balance of the court to shift to the left. And so they took a gamble that Trump would win. He won, and now the court is very heavily tilted to the conservative side. And why does that matter? Especially if you're a liberal, it matters because the liberals have relied on the court for all kinds of rights, privacy rights, same-sex marriage rights, okay, certain other types of rights where that due process clause has been used. So that's a long-winded answer to the question, but it's a really important thing to understand. And this is the kind of stuff where I'd probably take up a full lesson in class. But anyway, in other words, the significance of Roe versus Wade is it allowed the Supreme Court to impose upon the states policies that they didn't otherwise agree with, namely the right to an abortion. And by the way, I'm trying to cover this in a neutral. I'm looking at this at a constitutional mechanical thing, not about we're not going to debate whether abortion is right or wrong or anything like that. It's just the mechanics of how it works. Does that make sense? Okay. What is the difference between civil liberties and civil rights? We're going to crank through the rest of these questions quickly, I promise. Okay, real quick. Civil liberties are rights created by governmental institutions. Okay, we have the Civil Rights Act. That's an act of Congress that created rights that were not being upheld previously, namely the right to access in public buildings and things like that. Okay, civil liberties. And the easy way to remember it is, there was a debate initially on whether you even have a Bill of Rights because our founders believed in unalienable rights, inherent rights. So civil liberties are more like those inherent natural law derived rights where government power is limited to protect those rights. There's no better example of this than the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Congress is limited. Okay, that's what we mean by limited government. And that's also what we mean by this idea of civil liberties. Civil liberties require limitations on government to protect them because you're presumed to already have them. Civil rights, okay, it's going to sound unfeeling and I apologize. If you are, had the misfortune to become disabled, okay, or maybe you're born that way or whatever, okay, and you don't have the use of your legs. And forgive I promise you, I'm not trying to I'm just going to say it. Okay. Do you have a God-given right of entrance to a building? If you believe in that kind of thing. If you don't have legs, do you have a right of access? Use the stairs. Oh, you don't have legs? Oh, sorry, kid. Well, do you have a right now? Answer the question. How many of you believe you have a right of, in the United States of America, at least, if you're a handicapped person and you're in a wheelchair or whatever, do you have a right of access to a building today? Yes. Why? Because Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, creating that right that didn't exist naturally. That's just the way, I'm sorry. It's, I try to explain things through humor. Okay. If you're, disabled or know someone, I apologize if I offended you, but it's just, I think it's an example that makes sense. If you're disabled, the gods are not smiling on you, and but government can fix that with creating rights. I should probably not put this on YouTube. Okay. All right. Describe how the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is significant to civil rights issues. I'm going to get my head straight again. Okay, so what is the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? We've just looked at it. Congress shall make no law. Where is it? There it is. 14th Amendment. Nor shall any state deprive to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. That's the Equal Protection Clause. Okay, so describe how the Equal Protection Clause is significant to civil rights. Give at least 4 examples of different groups protected by this clause. Okay, well, African Americans, LGBT people, women, disabled people. There you go. I just did your homework for you. Okay, so it's significant because it forces the states to treat people equally under the law. And the problem is, where do we get our definition of what equality is? From the Supreme Court, and they botched it in 1896 only to, get it right in 54 with Brown. Okay, makes sense. Thumbs up. Got it. Okay. Explain how the government responded to social movements through the court rulings and policies in the following: Brown v. Board of Education, Civil Rights Act, Title IX. Okay, you just need to know what these are. Brown obviously was the decision that, and by the way, you do need to read that decision. And once again, I would strongly recommend my materials on that, just so you know. There it is. It's on page 95. Much easier to understand, case summary and everything like that. But you need to know the story. You need to tell, Linda Brown had to go across the dangerous rail yard because the whites only school wouldn't admit her, and so they sued, and basically the Supreme Court said, yeah, y'all got it wrong in 1896 because that's totally messed up. And they said that separating people by race is inherently unequal. And by the way, in all seriousness, this section right here, the opinion about the hearts and minds, separating children solely on the basis of race created a feeling of inferiority in the hearts and minds of African-American children. Segregating children in public education created and perpetuated the idea that African-American children held a lower status than white children, even if their separate educational facilities were substantially equal in tangible factors. So the big argument before that was like, well, the black school's got, it's the same size, it's got the same qualifications for their staff, it's, it's got the same desks, same books, so it's the same. Well, no, it's not the same, because you're forcing people to go there because of their skin color. So this idea of separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This is a 100% reversal of Plessy. Civil Rights Act was a law that remedied the Jim Crow era segregation policies formally. Notice that it took 10 years after Brown to get that done. 10 years. And I don't know if you guys have read it or not, but I want to pause for a moment and talk about, what transpired, because if you put it to a vote, segregation stays. And that, why is that? Because blacks were not allowed to vote in a reasonable way. They were, it wasn't formal discrimination, 15th Amendment at all. But practice and customs in the South, blacks were intimidated against voting. The risk of being lynched or having your house burned down or stuff like that was a very real thing back in those days. And it took the protection of law, specifically the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to remedy that, to where blacks all of a sudden feeling empowered to vote and could vote safely, because the Voting Rights Act made it a right. And don't forget, suffrage is not mentioned in the Constitution. That's why you have these laws. And by the way, this idea of social movements, real quickly, I want to hop over to a letter from a Birmingham jail. This is like a super important concept or writing. Okay, this is a letter from a Birmingham jail, one of your required readings. Everybody still with me? Need interaction. There we go. Get one person still listening. Thank you. There we go. Okay. Letter from a Birmingham jail. I'm just going to give you the quick and dirty classroom version of how I go over this. Okay. I'm going to use my camera. Might be a little dorky, but okay, here we are. This is my drink. Okay. I'm going to place, what can I place on here? I need something that's, there we go, a pen. The pen is on my drink and the pen is not moving. The pen is not going to move as long as I hold this thing like here, because of something called inertia. You guys studied inertia in your science class. What does that mean? Project in motion will stay in motion. A project at rest will stay at rest unless an outside force, this is very dramatic, by the way. I'll make this so you can all see, acts upon it. All right, are you ready? Okay, the outside force was my finger flicking the pen off, crashing into something on my desk. Anyway, okay, so segregation and Jim Crow was culturally a part of America, sadly, prior to the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King recognized this and knew that in order for there to be change, I cannot remember. Okay, fine. Zoom is telling me something. I have to do the screen share, but I have this big thing blocking it. So there we go. Oh, there it is. Okay. Y'all should see letter from Birmingham. Okay, here we go. So in this very lengthy essay, Martin Luther King basically says, you tell us to wait. Yeah, we're not doing that anymore. He talks about the 4 steps to self-purification, negotiation, direct action. And his focus is on direct action. And I'm going to skip to the good part. Okay. Paragraph 10. And by the way, I strongly recommend you read my materials on this because I've gone to the trouble of italicizing and bold printing the stuff that's important. Okay. So why direct action? Why sit-ins and marches and so forth? You guys studied this in your history class, right? The sit-ins. Okay. Why'd they do that? Because they risked getting beat up and getting arrested and stuff like that. Well, because if they didn't do anything, nothing would change. And so King, the reason we have Martin Luther King as a holiday, and I guess separate from Juneteenth, but the reason we have Martin Luther King Day as a holiday is because he is the one who developed a strategy to force America to look itself in the mirror and say, you know what, these are kind of bad policies, this segregation stuff, and it's kind of, damaging to our society. So, let's, and he specifically talked about this idea of creative tension. Okay, what does that mean? Tension tends to break stuff. Okay, he wanted to create tension in society to break segregation policy, and he did. And it took television images, it took time, it took effort, it took 10 years, but they did it. And, we're not perfect, but, if you live in Houston, I mean, to be honest, go to any institution. If you really want to see, go, by the way, they do this by appointment now. One of the good things about COVID, you get your driver's license renewed by appointment. But if you go to a jury pool and just look at who shows up, we are one of the most diverse societies. And, some people want to talk about systemic racism and all this stuff. I'm a person that thinks that we are light years beyond where we used to be, and better to focus on the positive, in my opinion. But anyway, okay. I am totally lost. What am I doing now? Oh, back to the questions. Okay. So all that to answer this question, because social movements can change policy. They do change policy. And let's be clear on this. The social movement that King was involved with was a legislative strategy to get laws passed to force the adoption of these rights where they otherwise weren't existing. And by the way, just a little side note, social movements can also pressure the government in other ways. And one of the unique things about our system is that we have, remember those access points? Okay. If you don't have a cooperative Congress, there's another route. You can have a social issue focused on getting the courts involved. Okay. Filing amicus briefs. The Supreme Court has judicial independence, but why do people gather in front of the Supreme Court and protest? Because they're not blind, right? So social movements can change policies through a number of different avenues. All right, Title IX is equality for women, Voting Rights Act, super important. Gerrymandering, and by the way, a lot of you in your essays, let's be clear on gerrymandering. Okay, racial gerrymandering is constitutionally permissible if it is designed to remedy a discriminatory judicial, a legislative district. But you cannot only use race in determining the shape of the district. That's what Shaw versus Reno said. And if we want to get super hyper technical, the court was using something called strict scrutiny, where they basically said the government had to have a compelling interest in the way that district was shaped. I don't know if you remember the Shaw versus Reno district. This one right here. Okay. There had to be a compelling reason why it was shaped that way. Otherwise, it had to be redone, and they couldn't get a compelling reason. So race was the only thing. You can't do race as the only consideration. Describe the debate over affirmative action. Explain what's meant by those who call the Constitution colorblind and those who claim the Constitution forbids racial classifications designed to harm minorities. Okay, so this is one of those thorny issues. Affirmative action was a policy that initially was trying to remedy the decades, well, centuries really, of discriminatory practices against African Americans and other minorities by inserting, instead of, issues of equality where you have, let's say, a level playing field, you bring in the notion of equity where you alter the playing field, so to speak, so that minority applicants or whatever could have an easier chance getting into colleges, and therefore once that, over time, that would have the effect of reducing discrimination and, whatever. It's always controversial because you're using race as a means of determining, admission standards or hiring standards. And so if the Constitution is colorblind, you shouldn't do that. If the Constitution, but here's the thing about that. We have all kinds of changing societal norms. So the debate over affirmative action is really, today, and by the way, it's interesting because the one class that is, and I think we're going to find out this summer, actually, have you heard about the Asian Harvard lawsuit? Okay. Harvard is not letting, if they looked at on paper qualifications, everybody walking the halls of Harvard would be Asian. Okay. It's just, I'm joking. Okay. Obviously, but there's no question that, if you look at the top of a graduating class and, at least where I teach, down at Tompkins, there's a, significant presence of Asians at the top of the class. That's just a fact. I mean, that's, and yet if you look at Harvard admissions, they're being denied admission because Harvard withholds a significant number of positions for, quote unquote, desirable minorities, people who have traditionally been discriminated against, Hispanics, specifically Blacks, and also a significant number of spaces for legacy appointments. Okay. So, if you're the son of a president or something like that, you're getting into Harvard. Okay. It doesn't matter how bad you are, you're getting in. Okay. So those are the things that people have, if you ask an average person, I think in a typical classroom, do you want to be judged by your, especially if you're in the top of the class AP student, do you want to be judged by your accomplishments or your skin color? Most people are going to say accomplishments. And that's the difficulty with affirmative action, is you're placing weight on an attribute that nobody can control. And, so anyway, okay. I feel like there's a lot more that we can go over. Does anybody have other questions, stuff you need to go over, anything that anything? Let me look at the module real quick and see if there's anything that I see that, where is the module? Okay. How about any of the cases? Has there been a test on oh God, we didn't go over any of the cases. Was there another question? Oh God, there's a question set that I missed. 3.1 First Amendment minor grade. Yep. Okay. Well, okay. I'll do the quick and dirty version of these real quick and we'll get on. I don't want to go more than an hour. Okay. 3.1. Why was it necessary to include the Bill of Rights in the Constitution? Because it was a compromise that the Anti-Federalists demanded. Okay. And also there was a concern that if you just leave it hanging out there, that states would, deny, or the federal government would deny rights. So better to articulate them. But the Bill of Rights, don't forget, is restrictions on government. Why civil liberties are the main protections in the Bill of Rights? Because those are the inherent rights that are presumed to be the most important: free speech, right to bear arms, due process rights. Okay. Those are mostly today considered fundamental rights. Explain how the Bill of Rights apply to the states through this interpretation of the Supreme Court. Okay, so this is really important stuff. The court has to wait for cases to come along. They can't just pick cases or pick policies to settle. Okay, so so over time, cases have come up and the court has interpreted various things. Okay, so do I need to go through these cases? These cases are pretty straightforward. Engel, State-sponsored prayer is not constitutional. Okay. Wisconsin versus Yoder. Okay. If you're an Amish parent, you don't have to send your kids. I was going to do it in Yoda voice. Send your children to school. You must not, Yoda, Star Wars nerd. Okay. So they're Amish. If they send their kids to school, they're going to have iPhones and stuff, so that's not really very Amish. I don't know if you've seen the Amish, but the Amish are all about like, that kind of stuff, wagons and, barns and whatnot, simple clothes. Okay. I'm from Iowa, where there's a reasonably sized Amish community, and my parents were like, we got to get Amish furniture because it's like really good and stuff, so we have an Amish, well, they sold it, but it was a table, and it was like, yeah, you could like, you could have a football team stand on that thing and it wouldn't collapse. It was very sturdy. Okay, I'm totally lost where we're at. 3.1. Here we go. Okay. Tinker versus Des Moines is the armband case. Okay. So the kids had their little armbands. Okay. And they're protesting the Vietnam War. Well, today it seems like, what's the big deal? But at that time, it was very likely that somebody in that classroom had a parent or a sibling that was off fighting and possibly even killed. And for these little punks to have their little armband, oh, I don't believe in the war. Well, that's true. A lot of people, I think most people today would say, yeah, we shouldn't have been to Vietnam. But at the time, it was like very controversial. And so the kids said, well, wait a minute, what about free speech? And so the Supreme Court said, yeah, you have free speech rights. So Tinker versus Des Moines was a kind of a victory for student speech. Not unlimited. They can restrict it if it's disruptive. So I don't know if you guys studied the my favorite case. Morse versus Frederick. There's a case that we talk about, bong hits for Jesus. So if you don't know what a bong is, that's probably a good thing, but it's a marijuana smoking device, water cooled pipe situation. And these kids had this sign, bong hits for Jesus. Well, this went all the way. I think the Supreme Court might've been smoking a little bit to decide to hear this case, to be honest with you, because they're like, of all the things they decide, they're deciding these goofy kids hold up this sign during some, assembly that says bong hits for Jesus, and the Supreme Court ends up hearing this case. What the heck are we, well, why isn't that student speech? Well, this is advocating drug use for Jesus, apparently, and advocating drug use is not something that you want happening in your schools, so the schools can restrict it, and the student speech is not upheld. So, by the way, if that shows up on the AP exam, that's almost certainly the case they're going to throw against it, because it's just hilarious. All right, so okay. Supreme Court attempts to balance social order and individual freedom with the First Amendment. Describe how the following would address defamatory, offensive, obscene statements and gestures, right of individuals to assemble. Okay, I'm going to go real quick through this stuff. Defamatory speech is prohibited. Okay, Schenck versus the United States is a court case that said, yes, I get it. It says Congress shall make no law. Well, guess what? Does that mean? So somebody says, I'm going to murder your friend. What do you think about that? I'm going to murder him right here in front of you. What do you think about that? Oh, Your Honor, First Amendment. I was joking. I mean, come on. No, that is called fighting words, and that sort of thing is prohibited. So the Schenck case, you got this guy mailing out leaflets to, encourage people to write their congressman to resist the draft. Well, that violated the Espionage Act. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? There are limits. There are limits to speech. And, so in other words, no law is not absolute. And then New York Times or United States is the Pentagon Papers case, which is a really important case. And by the way, once again, just to plug my materials here, all these cases are very neatly summarized in the back of this packet. So I would strongly recommend you find them and go over them. But where are we on here? wonder what that question said was so short. There's two more of them. Okay. New York Times versus the United States. Basically, Daniel Ellsberg, who is this guy right here. He's old now, but at the time he was younger. Daniel Ellsberg was a Pentagon guy and basically figured out the Vietnam War as being, the story being told by our media was a lie. We weren't winning the war. The war was a train wreck from the start. We should never have been there. So as the war was coming to a conclusion, Daniel Ellsberg decided to dump what they called the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the only problem with that is he had stolen the documents. So if you've ever seen the movie The Post, that's what the case is about, or that's what the movie is about, the decision to publish these papers. And anyway, long story short, the Supreme Court said, well, freedom of the press is a fundamental right. It's different from freedom of speech because this is fundamental to a functioning democracy to challenge authority. And if the government screwed up the Vietnam War and how it was conducted, people should know about that so it doesn't happen again. And so the court, in a very tortured opinion with 6, by the way, a little pause for dramatic effect here. Okay, this case was issued as what's called a per curiam opinion. I need you to write that down. PERCURIAM, per curiam opinion. That means an opinion by the court. Okay. And what that means is that they couldn't come to a full consensus to have a majority opinion because the issues were so complicated. But what they all in the end agreed on, at least 6 of them did, was that you shouldn't not allow this stuff to be printed just because it was stolen. They still have a right to publish. And, and that's the way the court resolved the case. And by the way, the dissenting opinions probably would have agreed. And the reason they used for their dissent was that they didn't have enough time to consider the case. So, this case was done in a matter of days, and cases like this usually take, much, much longer. Just show you the case brief here real quickly, because this is a pretty darn important case. That's one of the more complicated cases, actually. If I can find it here. Schenk, Tinker, Gideon will come to in a second here. Here it is, New York Times versus the United States. Okay, and you can see there's the per curiam. And in a per curiam opinion, there is no majority opinion, there's only concurrences. So that's really rare, by the way. But one of them was like, this is an absolute power of the press, freedom of the press. Another one was like, well, the war has already happened and they're describing stuff that already happened. There's no troops in harm's way. So, let them publish anyway. So it's a complicated case. Questions? Hang in there. I know I usually go an hour, but we'll go a little bit over today. Okay. 3.2. Explain what the court has ruled on the 8th Amendment. Okay, I'm going to give you we're going to do a quick and dirty round. Here we go. I'm going to do this with minimal interference. The Supreme Court has said with regard to the death penalty, it's cruel and unusual punishment to execute someone who is a minor when the crime was committed or who is mentally unable to understand the charges. Those are the two. That's why capital defendants, people who are accused of capital murder, always claim insanity, because if they're determined to be insane, they can't be executed. Okay. In regards to the Second and Fourth Amendment, describe the debate about public safety and whether or not the government regulation of firearms or collection of digital metadata promotes or interferes with public safety. Okay. This is kind of a dated question because the collection of digital metadata, that was something that the government started doing after 9/11, unbeknownst to us. That's what Edward Snowden is famous for, by the way, if you don't know him. I'm doing what I said he wouldn't do. Okay. This is a guy who basically leaked to the New York Times and the Washington Post that the government was basically collecting everybody's personal data and storing it in huge server farms in Nevada or something like that. I don't know, Utah, one of those Western states. Anyway, that's what the bulk collection of metadata was about. And of course, that violates your Fourth Amendment rights to hello, Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, warrant requirement and all that. So anyway, with regard to the Second Amendment as well, you have the public safety. Do we want to live in a society where everyone's armed, or, and by the way, obviously this is a serious issue. Because if you ban guns, a supporter of the Second Amendment would say, well, then only the criminals are going to have guns and the good guys can't defend themselves. Okay. And of course, the argument against the Second Amendment rights is that, look, when the Second Amendment was written, the actual language of the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia, in order to being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's the Second Amendment right there. Okay. And, if you're a gun control person, you're going to say, this is the reason you have the right to bear arms, because we needed a militia. Now we have a standing army. You don't need to have a, automatic machine gun, in your gun case, to go hunt deer or something like that. You'd have, can you imagine eating a deer that's been pumped full of lead by a machine gun? It wouldn't probably be very practical. So, so the gun control is okay. Now, if you're a conservative, you look at this part and say the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the word shall, that's commanding language. The history and tradition of our country is replete with gun ownership, from the founding days where it was a necessity to just the gun enthusiasts of today. And so, there's this ongoing debate. Well, we just tragically seen the other side of the debate, which is that if you don't have some sort of reasonable gun control, and by the way, if I had to make an educated guess about what's going to come out of this, and it's really tough because, and by the way, personally, if I view like owning one of those scary weapons as kind of like, the government doesn't trust 18, you can go off to war, but you can't drink alcohol. So why don't we increase the age to 21 for all that stuff? You can't get deployed in the military till you're 21. Okay. And you can't buy a gun till you're 21. I think that's probably the most likely change. If anything comes out of this, probably nothing will happen because Congress is gridlocked, but if I had to guess. Okay. Really, I know we're been going a long time here, but really important stuff here in part 3. How do the Second and 14th Amendment apply to the Supreme Court ruling in McDonald versus Chicago, including your discussion, selective incorporation? Okay, so the right to own a gun was not considered a fundamental right until 2010. That's not that long ago. And the College Board chose this case to teach the concept of selective incorporation, which is basically, I'll give you a definition, okay? Case by case, over time, when the Supreme Court applies a principle of law to the states and forces the states to adhere to it using the 14th Amendment, okay, Congress, or no state shall deny equal protection of the law. No state shall deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process, okay? When the court uses the 14th Amendment to enforce one of those principles of law, whether it's free speech rights or, the right to the free press, search and seizure laws, whatever it may be, or in this case, the right to own a gun, that is called selective incorporation. So the gradual process, I'll give you a definition, the gradual process of applying federal principles of law to the states on a case-by-case basis over time. And McDonald versus Chicago, okay, well, let's talk about that case. Chicago, like New York and other big cities, had laws where the only way to legally possess a gun was to have the magazine out. Couldn't be loaded, had to have a trigger lock, had to be in a gun safe, had all these restrictions, so, you hear the break of the window in the middle of the night and, hold on a minute, got to get my gun to go, yeah. It renders the reasonable purpose of owning a gun in the first place is negated by the law that requires having it in a state where it could be used to be a violation of the law. So that's what that case is about. And the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, that's a dumb law. So, right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right. States have to allow concealed carry laws, stuff like that. Okay, Supreme Court has ruled in favor of states' powers to restrict. Explain how the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of states' power to restrict individual liberty. Can you say COVID? Can you say lockdowns? Okay. I don't know if the court has ruled in those cases, but restrict individual liberty. What does that mean? Let's use a non-controversial one like the First Amendment. Okay. Should you be able to, I always use this example, but should you be able to threaten someone and claim the First Amendment protects that right? No. So that's a restriction on individual liberty. Okay. Can you own well, that's a bad example. Guns is always a bad example. But there are instances where individual liberty is curtailed, okay, for the greater good, okay. For example, you do not have the individual liberty to drive your Tesla Plaid, if you're fortunate enough to have one, at 120 miles an hour, because that's a danger to other people. So that's a restriction on your liberty to protect other people's rights. It's a balance. Liberty versus order. That's one of the main themes of the course. The Miranda rule, you have the right to remain silent. Everything you say can never be used to you in court of law. Okay, that's the standard admonition that the police have to give you when you're arrested. Because at that moment of arrest, a lot of people are, they're vulnerable and they spill their guts and incriminate themselves, where, the fifth, and then the Fifth Amendment is voided because you've already, made an admission. So the Miranda case, which is not a required case, but the Miranda rule is, you're required to know that, is rooted in the Fifth Amendment. Restrictions on evidence. So that's Mapp versus Ohio, which is not a required case, but illegally or improperly obtained evidence is excluded from trial. So you got to have a properly executed warrant, has to specify what you're looking for, on and on. Explain how the Supreme Court has allowed unwarned interrogation to be used as evidence in court. Wow. Did you have a case on that? Unwarned interrogation to be used as evidence in court. I have no idea what that question is asking, honestly. I don't know what it's relevant to in the curriculum. Unwarned interrogation. Okay, so let me give you just some legal stuff, and and yes, I do have a law degree. It's a long story, but U of H 2003 graduated while teaching. But anyway, not that matters. But the police have let me just give you an example. If a crime occurs, okay, and let's just say it's something, I don't know, something, destruction of property, okay, and let's say you're an undercover police officer, okay, and you just you're in a touristy area and you happen to have your cell phone camera going, and you're walking along and you witness somebody and your camera captures it torching a building, and you see the guy, okay, and you follow the person as fast as you can, and they escape into a building, and you got clear images of the guy, you know who he is, you know who it was, you know the person that did it. And as a police officer, can you enter that building, pursue that guy, or can the guy go, you got a warrant? I didn't think so. And then no, that's an example where an unwarranted, in other words, here's an easy way to think of it. Okay. What does the Fourth Amendment protect against? Against unreasonable search and seizure. It is not unreasonable to pursue somebody who a police officer was an eyewitness to, if you're an eyewitness to a crime. Okay. That's not unreasonable. So maybe that's what they're getting at. The interest of national security during times of crisis. What rights has the Supreme Court allowed law enforcement agencies to infringe upon? Fourth Amendment rights. Fourth Amendment rights, specifically the right to have your personal effects free from government intrusion if you're a terror suspect. Okay. The Patriot Act permits warrantless searches of terror suspects on certain circumstances in a time of crisis. So the trick is to how do we stay out of crises? You know, technically, according to the government, the COVID-19 pandemic is still a crisis. It's, you know, and I don't know if you've followed the news or not, but just this summer they announced that the school free and reduced lunch, or the free lunch program is finally ending this summer, as is the pause on student loan repayments and things like that. So, you know, in times of crisis, you can do all kinds of things that you can't do normally. So just keep that in mind. Usually we're talking about some sort of, you know, military threat, but it can also obviously be other things. What has significant trial rights? What has significant trial rights in this? What? Okay, this is a mistype. What significance trial rights has the Supreme Court guaranteed? Gideon. Okay, so the Gideon case is Matt versus Ohio. Okay, Gideon was a poor, I would say, elderly man, although as I get older, my definition of elderly changes. Because I want to say he was not too much older than I was when this happened, but I don't consider myself. Anyway, there he is, Clarence Gideon. He was a feeble, you know, kind of skinny guy, old, and he got arrested for breaking and entering in a pool hall in Pensacola, Florida. So it's kind of just drove through Florida, by the way. Saw a lot of these small towns, so you can kind of imagine what it was like. But anyway, he gets charged with petty larceny. He gets a 5-year prison sentence. Usually that's a slap on the wrist, pay a fine and go home. 5 years in jail. And at his trial, he didn't have a lawyer and he asked for one. And so the court basically denied his right to a lawyer, and he filed suit. And the plain language of the Constitution, and here it is in the Sixth Amendment: in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall have a right to a speedy public trial and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Now, if you've been paying attention, was it the federal or the state governments that this initially restricted? Federal. He's being prosecuted by the state of Florida. So under existing precedent, the judge said, you don't have a right to a lawyer, and this is not a federal trial. But Gideon was smart enough to recognize that we have the 14th Amendment. No, nor shall any state deprive any person of liberty without due process of law. Due process, by definition, means fairness in the administration of justice. Denial of a lawyer under the Sixth Amendment, which was incorporated by this case, by the way, is now considered a violation of equal protection. So you have a right to a lawyer now because of that case. Okay. Just my seat. Questions? Was this helpful? Yes. Okay. Mia, Aaron, I see Nia, Hudson. Can I get a thumbs up if you're paying attention still? Ash. Excellent. All righty. Well, thanks for tuning in. I'll stick around if you want to have some one-on-one time or whatever. If you have questions or if you want to look at past exams, but otherwise, I think we've been at it a while. So, are we good? All right. Well, I'm going to end it. Yeah. Oh, I have one question in the chat. Will you go over the policy paper? Yes. Thank you. Okay. All right. I'm going to tell you my, first of all, if it were up to me, we would forego the policy paper, but we have to do it. So here's the thing. The policy paper has to be about, are you ready for this? A policy. Okay. It can't be about an issue. It has to be about a policy. Okay. So affirmative action is a policy. Getting involved in funding Ukraine is a policy. The affirmative or the Affordable Care Act is a policy. Americans with Disabilities Act is a policy. Okay. Even a gun control law could be a policy, but here's the thing. The paper is supposed to address an existing policy. So you have to look at a policy that's already been enacted. My favorite one, and I don't care if every single one of you does this, it would make my life easier to read. I think one of the most significant misguided policies in the United States is student loans. They will, as an 18-year-old, they'll look you over and think, you want to go to Baylor, huh? You want $250,000 to go to Baylor to study sociology. Okay, here you go. No problem. You don't have any collateral. We don't care. And then you go, and then you're saddled with $250,000 debt as a 21-year-old. That's insanity. Okay. And we're currently, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but speaking of COVID, the government has changed its loan repayment requirements for people that are in public service. So you can actually, they're basically granting carte blanche loan forgiveness to anyone who's a teacher, firefighter, member of the military, anything like that. And if you've been making payments since 2007 and, or after 2007, because people can't get out of debt. So that's a great one. You have my permission to do that one if you want to do student loans. Otherwise, just make sure it's about a policy. Okay. Anything else? All right. Have a good day. We'll see you guys and enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck on your exam. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.